I'd like to thank the National Library of Israel for the invitation to talk this evening. And I'm really delighted to be here to discuss a very important but little known resource, and not just on Irish Jewry, but more generally on the history of the mass emigration period. This was what historians, the name that historians give to the period between 1881 and 1914, when between 1.5 and 2.5 million Jews left Eastern Europe for the West. So I'm here to talk about the Chronicle of Meir Joel Wigader, who was born in Lithuania in 1855 and died in 1933 in Dublin. And I'm delighted to see that there are extended members of the Wigader family present this evening. Ireland was a small outpost on the international map of mass migration, and it's often been treated as something of an oddity or a special case by historians or chroniclers, as if it was somehow different to the other sites of migration. As Wigader's diary shows, it was very much a part of the bigger processes of mass migration at this time. And the diary, or Chronicle as Wigader called it himself, is particularly important for the personal insights it offers into the experience of migration, and also because it supports current scholarly thinking and understandings of this process. So now I'm just going to share my screen with you. So the Chronicle was acquired by the National Library of Israel in 2016. After Wigader's death, it went out of the family's possession and only came to light some 80 years later, when its significance was immediately recognized, and the library acquired it with the help of the Wigader family and translated it into English. And I'd like to thank Dr. Yoel Finkelman of the National Library of Israel for sharing this translation with me. It's been a hugely important resource for my work, and I'm really very grateful to have had access to it. The Chronicle adds a lot of valuable substance and detail to Wigader's official memoir, which was published after his death in 1935. And I'm not entirely sure what relationship the official memoir has to the Chronicle, whether it was something that Wigader had himself developed from the Chronicle, or whether it was something that his descendants had adapted from the Chronicle for publication. Wigader also wrote a number of scholarly works on Jewish themes and texts, which are held by the National Library. And he was described by Isaac Herzog in the preface to the published memoir as a fine example of a Talmid Chacham, or as Herzog describes it, a merchant scholar. Wigader also corresponded with the Hebrew press. The significance of his chronicle cannot be emphasized enough. The Chronicle and the published autobiography are the only first-hand accounts we have of migration and settlement in Ireland. All of the other early accounts we have come to us either second or third hand, or don't relate to actual migration itself. For example, we have accounts by Jessie Spiro Bloom, which largely just recall growing up in Dublin. And she discusses her parents a little bit in the Chronicle and their experience, or in her works and their experiences, but it's largely about early Jewish life in Dublin. We also have some memoirs from Hannah Berman, but Berman was so young when she travelled to Ireland that her recollections are not necessarily reliable, and they conflict on a number of points with more reliable sources. Wigader's Chronicle is also significant in terms of its personal insights. And when we're looking at any kind of a mass movement or event, it's very, very easy to lose the personal individual perspective. Also, even though this was a time where community was a far more real and tangible thing than it often feels nowadays, society in general was not as kind or as understanding of people's personal difficulties and circumstances necessarily. The mentality of the day for migrants was to look to the future and bury the past, with the consequence that a lot of information and personal detail from that time has been lost to later generations. One of the most exciting things about the Chronicle is that it includes a number of letters that Wigader exchanged with friends, family, and acquaintances from the time when he first began to consider leaving Lithuania until after he settled in Dublin. These add to the individual insider perspective that the Chronicle offers on the migration process. And this is particularly relevant for historians because our work demands that we try to remain objective and impersonal. So it can be very easy under these circumstances to lose sight or access to the human aspect of events. Wigader's Chronicle allows us better to appreciate the traumatic aspects of migration that are so easily forgotten in the general spin on migration as a success story. The Chronicle reveals the invisible pain and baggage of this process that was, in a sense, the silent shadow of the success story. And we can also see the hardship that was involved in establishing oneself and succeeding in a new place, reminding us that this success was not necessarily a given. So I've taken the title of my talk from an Irish literary work, Deoraí, The Diary of an Exile by Donal Macaulay, which was published in 1960 and was on for a long time on the Irish language syllabus in secondary schools. It somehow seemed appropriate. When I was thinking about this evening's topic, it occurred to me that although a lot of comparisons have been made between the Irish and the Jewish experience, not all of which are entirely useful or appropriate, one aspect that has never been considered is the role or the concept of exile. And this is perhaps a little bit curious, as exile and diaspora are central elements or themes within both the Irish and the Jewish experience. And it's also quite convenient because it allows me to talk about it today. On the surface, the two types of exile may not necessarily be that similar. And when we think about the theological concept of galut, there's no significant difference between galut in the Russian Empire or in Ireland. But aside from the theological element, there are other parallels. And one important one would be the economic parallel, because both Jews and the Irish migrated for economic reasons a lot of the time. There is also an element of permanence, even though Irish exile, latterly anyway, was tended to be thought of as temporary. And a good example of this would be a book that was on the Leaving Certificate syllabus when I was doing Irish then, Cashlon or Golden Castles, which discusses the story of a young man who goes to Scotland initially for 3 months to pick potatoes. And the 3 months gradually turns into 20 or 30 years as he moves on from one temporary job to another. And eventually he comes back and finds his fiancée, who he's had little or no contact with in all this time, sitting at her spinning wheel in her cottage. And he just kind of strolls in the door and says, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And she said, "Oh, I'm fine, how are you?" kind of thing. And he just, they exchange a few superficial pleasantries, and then he walks out the door and that's it. He never comes back. So I think that quite well encapsulates the Irish thinking on exile, that often when people went abroad, that it was supposed to be for a short time and it could become a lifetime. Okay, now where was I? So the Jewish exile, on the other hand, was considered to be more of a permanent thing. However, it wasn't necessarily permanent. Because this notion conceals a significant rate of repatriation or return migration to the Russian Empire, which occurred at a much higher rate than we often realize, and was often on a voluntary, undertaken on a voluntary level, as people found it just too difficult to settle into their new place. And the easiest option was to return to what was familiar in the Russian Empire. There was a feeling that was shared between the Jews and the Irish of being a stranger in a strange land. And it's been argued that the Irish and the Jews identified with each other in this experience and found an affinity in their different places of exile, in New York or in London, where there were quite sizable Irish and Jewish communities. Riona Ní Riail, who's looked at Irish language literature that discusses Jews, has also found that there was an underlying tension between the communities, as well as perhaps an occasional level of affinity. And it's interesting, or it would be interesting, I think, to be able to investigate to what extent these tensions mirrored the underlying tensions that might have existed between the Jews and the Irish on Irish soil. So we can see that there were common economic, cultural, and political aspects of exile. As economic exile was always frowned upon, we can see both the Jews and the Irish have romanticized it and sugarcoated it a little bit to transform it into something that would be more palatable for others. So on the Irish side, we can see literary and poetic expressions of longing for Ireland, which go back to, I think, the 16th or 17th centuries. For Jews, the economic motives for migration are concealed by dramatic tales of pogroms, conscription, and accidental arrival. Both accidental arrival and expressions of longing essentially express the same idea, that the person or people concerned are not where they should really be or where they had really intended to be. Returning to the Chronicle, according to Wigader's own introduction, it had two purposes. The first was to be a record of his life and his memories. That would be for him a kind of aid memoir in later life, when perhaps his memory had dimmed of earlier events. Its second purpose would be to be a kind of an ethical will, although I see that from the National Library of Israel records that he did in fact create a second ethical will. The Chronicle also does have a purpose of reminding Wigader's children and his later descendants to stay on the straight path in life, be true to their background, faith, and identity as Jews, no matter what difficulties life should present. So there are both moral and halachic elements to this, if we consider the kind of translation or the general understanding of halakha as a path or a way. So Wigader states at one point, no one on earth passes all his life without hardship. If a person sees that a host of difficulties come upon him, God forbid, he should not despair of his future, for he will not end his days in hardship. He should just await God's salvation. For God smites and heals, raises his hands against us, and then comforts us. For several things happened to me, which caused me to give up all hope. And then I saw that God's salvation comes in the blink of an eye. In the evening, there is lamentation, and in the morning, joy. Wigader began his chronicle in 1884, aged 31, after he lost almost everything, including an earlier diary, in a house fire that destroyed much of his village in Laicheva in Lithuania. This catastrophic event started Wigader on the path of migration. Try as he might, he simply could not recover from the financial loss that he experienced or re-establish himself in some kind of viable business. He did try a few different things, but it proved to be just too difficult. And he decided that the only answer was to do what so many others were doing and leave the country, but we'll return to this in a while. First, there are some details about Wigader's life in Lithuania that are worth mentioning as a corrective to traditional Jewish concepts of our ancestors' lives in Eastern Europe. The first point would be Jewish-Christian relations. The Chronicle indicates that these were relatively good overall in Laicheva, because I would see more positive references in the Chronicle than negative ones to Christian neighbours and acquaintances. For example, when Wigader was in Dublin, he heard that the local priest in Laicheva had bequeathed 500 rubles to the Jewish poor of the village. The Chronicle indicates that the issues that Wigader experienced were more with the authorities than with the locals. Part of his difficulty was that he was unable to claim on his insurance after the fire. He was repeatedly obstructed in his attempts by the authorities and ended up spending quite a lot of money pursuing the claims, but was eventually forced to write off his insurance altogether. On a personal level, things appear to have been reasonably cordial between Jews and Christians, and it was more on the official level where difficulties arose. The Irish historian Dermot Keogh, whose book Jews in 20th Century Ireland, published in 1998, was seen as the first and last word on the community when it came out, but was quite problematic on a number of points, suggested that the fire that destroyed Wigader's home occurred in the course of a pogrom. However, as Cormac O'Grada noted in 2006, there is absolutely no evidence for this. In fact, Wigader describes how the fire swept through the entire village, destroying the church and many houses. And he says, the entire town had become a killing field and a wasteland. Everywhere there were only ruins, and all our eyes saw was wreckage. And he describes how many people lost everything and were made homeless as a result of the fire and left to beg on the streets. The second point that's important to note is regarding Jewish conscription, because draft evasion is seen to be one of the principal reasons for emigration. And it's commonly thought that many of the migrants were draft-age boys. However, scholars such as David Cesarani have noted that the accuracy of this idea has never been tested. And in fact, various records such as naturalization records, aliens records, and military records indicate that many male migrants had served in the Russian army prior to leaving. Wigader recalls that when he was 22, he was summoned to the local conscription centre. And he says, after paying the fees and a huge amount of trouble, I was released, for they assumed I was 23 years old, so over the age of conscription. He was handed a certificate of exemption that was signed by some high-ranking officers. Later that year, his brother Bernard was also exempted, having been reckoned to be 22. And there is no mention of conscription in relation to either of Wigader's other brothers, so we can assume that none of the Wigaders actually served in the Russian army or had any significant difficulty in gaining exemption. Thirdly, Wigader travelled legally. He left the Russian Empire legally. One of the letters he received from his brother George states the documents he needed to do so. These were a passport, preferably a foreign passport, and a certificate of good conduct. And probably Wigader would have required his army exemption to get this certificate. The vast majority of migrants are well known to have travelled illegally, and historians estimate that it could have been up to 80% of all migrants. But this was not because they were not entitled to leave the Russian Empire legally. It was largely because many of them had little or no experience with the bureaucracy involved, and they were intimidated by it. So it was easier for them simply to take the illegal route. It was also costly to get a passport, though leaving illegally was also expensive because people had to be bribed and guides had to be paid to conduct people across the border. To bring them across illegally, that is. Emigration itself was illegal in the Russian Empire, but foreign travel was not. And we see from Wigader's Chronicle in real time the decisions and processes that were involved in making the journey. Wigader's reasons for leaving Lithuania also conflict with traditional ideas of discrimination, persecution, and asylum seeking. For him, it seems to have been entirely economic, and this is underpinned at various points in the Chronicle. The first reference he makes to this is in reflecting on his childhood, when he recalls that all his friends from that time were dispersed because, as he says, all are struggling to earn a livelihood. Wigader does attribute the rocketing rates of Jewish emigration in the 1880s to baseless accusations of many non-Jewish oppressors. And he's probably referring to accusations that Jews had masterminded the assassination of Alexander II, which had led to anti-Jewish violence and discriminative legislation, the May laws that were brought in 1882. However, Wigader sees the main consequence of the May laws as being deprivation. He says, food has been stripped away from the mouths of thousands of people. Because the May laws are thought to have had severe economic consequences for many Jews. Although I was at a talk during the week where an economic historian queried this, and because he hasn't found any proof, any concrete proof of this. So his argument is that it was a combination of economic hardship or difficulties, and more importantly, perhaps, the ability for the first time to migrate as travel networks increased and expanded. However, Wiggerter makes a number of references throughout his chronicle to the decrease in commerce that he observes among the Jewish community, to difficulties in making a living, and the way that this has encouraged emigration. And this is in references both in Wiggerter's own letters and or in his own reflections and in letters that he received from Lithuania. A typical comment would be one from a letter that he received from his brother Israel in 1896, which describes making a living in Russia as being as difficult as the splitting of the Red Sea. Wiggerter's reply, in which he outlines the character of the Dublin community, states that most people were forced to travel to Ireland by deprivation in their countries of origin. The decision to leave Lithuania was just the first step for Wiggerter. The next question he faced was where to go. And as we can see from his contemplations, this was far from being a panicked flight from persecution. His chronicle shows that it was a calculated process, a weighing up of various different factors in order to arrive at the best possible decision for Wiggerter personally. So this is very much in line with Gur al-Rawi's findings, based on an examination of the archives of the Jewish emigration bureaus in the Russian Empire. Al-Rawi has found that the more information people had, the better, and the more secure they felt in their decision to emigrate, and the less intimidating the whole process became for them. And Wiggerter's correspondence with his brother George offers a fascinating insight into how this played out on the individual level. The first place that Wiggerter seriously considered was the most obvious, America. However, George consistently advised him against this choice. He pointed out the difficulties that Meyer would encounter arriving in the teeming city of New York with no contacts, no English, and no trade. George told him or reminded him that his only option would be factory work. So Meyer would be forced to desecrate Shabbat, because all of the factories were generally open on Saturdays. So he would, as George puts it, he would lose his share in the world to come for money in this world. George believed that Meyer would be better off if he was to become a labourer, as a day labourer in one of the new Jewish settlements in Palestine. The only alternative to factory work would have been peddling, and this would be no easy living. In America at the time, there was a glut of peddlers, as well as the language barriers that made customers a lot less sympathetic and open and interested in peddlers and their wares. George's next letter advised his brother to choose the Netherlands as opposed to America. As he pointed out, the journey would be much shorter, easier, and less expensive. Also, George had a friend who might have been able to help Meyer find work teaching Hebrew or preaching in synagogues. George's friends also recommended a route that went through 15 different towns where Meyer could be helped by the local Jewish community once he could provide character references. And this was how Meyer met the expense of the journey. The next advice that he received from George was to consider commercial pursuits in the Netherlands because it was a good centre for international trade. However, George warns him that it would be hard to establish himself there and that Meyer would be totally alone and he would have to be strong. George cautioned him to keep his destination a secret so that others wouldn't follow him there and presumably compete with him for whatever work was available. As Meyer began to feel increasingly nervous, George continued to write, reminding him that it was never going to be easy, but it was still his best option to leave Russia, as economic difficulties there were simply insurmountable. Meyer decided to take this advice, and he left for the Netherlands on the 5th of July, 1889, after a brief wait for his passport. The first leg of his journey was by steamer to Kovno. He travelled from there to Jurbarkas, took a wagon to Sovetsk, which was near what's now Kaliningrad, which was then known as Königsberg, which was an important exit port in East Prussia for the US. In Königsberg, Wigader stayed in a traveller's hostel, where he paid 50 pfennig to be crammed in with many other people. It was so overcrowded that they were forced to sleep on tables, benches, and the floor without pillows or bedclothes. The steamer on to Königsberg was chaotic. He describes it, or Meyer describes it as being full of people like locusts, all traveling to America, and many objects were strewn everywhere. He spent Shabbat in Königsberg, strolling around the city and admiring its sights. He recalled that he was especially fascinated by the fountains and how they shot water high up into the air. Wigader then visited George in Halle, where George was a medical student. He also visited an uncle in Leipzig and a rabbi friend of George's in Aurich. In a letter to his rabbi in Lejeva, Wigader described a reform shul that he visited in Germany. He remembers being shocked to see people carrying things on Shabbat and wearing tiny talitot around their necks. And he says, during the prayers, my blood boiled within me as a boiling pot, and I stayed there as if standing on a fiery grate. So he makes a very unfavorable comparison with the traditional observance that he was accustomed to in the Russian Empire and continued throughout his life. On the 24th of September, Wigader finally arrived in Amsterdam, having travelled further on through Germany and the Netherlands. But he didn't find things easy there. After 5 weeks, he had still not managed to find work that would be suitable to support his family. And he decided to travel on to Antwerp with a friend from Lithuania, Moses Surnamer, whom he had met in Amsterdam. Surnamer had been longer in Amsterdam and had tried and failed at a number of things and run out of money. Wigader was embarrassed that he had barely managed to save any money to send home in all of his time there. One of the best things that had happened to him had been to meet a Russian-born man who took him under his wing and hosted him every Shabbat. Aside from this, Wigader ate only dry bread, as he couldn't afford either to eat at a kosher inn or to buy his own utensils to cook for himself. Wigader travelled to Antwerp by steamer with Surnamer at the end of November 1889. Again, Antwerp was not for him a very positive experience. The Jewish community, he recalls, was fairly small and spread out across the city. Wigader found that they kept to themselves and were unwelcoming towards strangers. He and Surnamer rented a small room together and pooled their money to buy kosher cheese, tea, and cheap toys to sell. While this business was initially profitable, the supply of goods was not reliable enough. Surnamer let Wigader down and they were forced to terminate the partnership. Wigader was probably lucky to come out of it with 10 francs to his name. He then began selling goods in various taverns. This again seemed viable in the beginning, though it was very hard and exhausting work, particularly as Wigader was still not able to afford to eat properly, and he began to lose his strength and to become disillusioned with Antwerp. So he starts to wonder at this point what he was going to do next, whether he should just throw in the towel, return to Lejeva, whether he should travel on to London or back towards Germany. At this point, he seems to have gone off the idea of America and to have felt that he would be no better off there than in Antwerp. He was strongly tempted to return to Lithuania and to his family, but his brothers George and Israel continued to caution him against this because of the lack of economic opportunity. Eventually, in March 1890, Wigader writes to his uncle Shimon Horowitz that he's decided to travel onwards to Dublin, saying, "There I will make the acquaintance of my friends from long ago, who have found there a resting place for their feet, and perhaps I will also succeed there." He left Antwerp after Pesach, took a steamer to Hull, and where the passage was very stormy. Wigader was extremely seasick and miserable, and he describes how he lay like an inert stone for approximately 15 hours. Just infrequently, the silence was disturbed by my dreadful groans, which burst out from the bottom of my heart. I did not recite the morning prayers, and I did not eat for 24 hours. At this point, the Chronicle diverges from Wigader's published autobiography, because it suggests that he barely broke his journey in England before travelling onwards to Liverpool and then to Dublin. His published memoir, on the other hand, states that he spent several months in England, first in Leeds, where his experience reportedly convinced him that employment in Dublin would be more congenial, more in keeping with my tastes and education. Perhaps he was unable to afford to travel straight on to Dublin, as he seems to have spent a few more miserable months in Liverpool, subsisting on whatever casual work he was able to find. Although Wigader's initial impressions of Dublin were very positive, it's not entirely clear whether he was entirely set on making a go of things here, or whether he regarded it as a step on the way to somewhere else, a place where he could earn enough to travel onwards, as his grandson Geoffrey suggests. Weighing up the various deliberations in the Chronicle and the correspondence and offers of financial assistance from Wigader's brothers, it seems to me more likely that his confusion about Dublin was part and parcel of the general uncertainty that was faced by migrants as they strove to re-establish themselves in an unfamiliar environment. There was the quandary of whether the current destination offered them the best possibilities or whether there was something better available for them elsewhere. And this is a doubt that seems to have plagued people throughout their lives, because you see migrants continuing to move onwards even after years in the one place, which suggests that this remained for them an open-ended question. My own great-grandparents, Solomon and Malka Klein, relocated to Dublin in 1920 after around 40 years in Cork. Malka's parents, whom she appears to have travelled to Ireland with, ended up making Aliyah. So Wigader describes his own feelings shortly after arriving in Dublin as a despair about not putting an end to my wanderings, until he began to be able to earn a living and to feel a little bit more secure in himself. As I said, his initial impressions of Dublin were positive. He found it much less polluted than the English cities he had passed through, and the fresh air immediately lifted his spirits. Although he had a little trouble locating his one and only contact in the city, Rabbi Abraham Eppel, who originally came from the nearby village of Exile in Lithuania, and whose details he had received from his mother. When Wigader did eventually find Eppel by a slightly roundabout route, he received a very gracious welcome. Eppel was able to direct him towards Joseph Matofsky, who is described in the Chronicle as the administrator of the Hospitality Committee. And it's quite interesting to see that even at this quite early point in the migration to Dublin or to Ireland, that there was already some kind of a formal system set up for welcoming people. Matofsky turned out to be a relative of Wigader's wife, Tamara, and he was able to find Wigader somewhere to live and help him start working as a peddler. Wigader describes how when he went out for a stroll during Shavuot, I met many friends and acquaintances wherever I went, and they raised my spirits. After the festival, he started hawking pictures, and he describes how he was a little bit gullible to begin with, but he soon found his footing and became a little more discerning and better at choosing his customers. He gradually began to earn enough money to rent his own flat with the help of 2 lodgers, and he was able to start sending money home to his wife. Wigader also tells us something of his business as a peddler. He recalls that the hours of business were from 11 in the morning to 5 in the evening, and a 1-year trading permit cost 5 shillings. Within a few months, by Sukkot, he had sent £7 home to his wife and 2 rubles to his mother. By July 1891, Wigader had sent his wife approximately £12 and saved 13 to start his own business. He reflected to one friend that he had been freed from his suffering on arrival in Dublin. To another, he said, "The months of my wandering shocked and frightened me. My spirit and heart sank into an abyss of oblivion." He felt at peace in Dublin and safe from the poverty that he recalls as having stalked him in Europe, and he was confident that he could soon be reunited with his family. By September 1891, Wigader's wife was able to wind up their affairs in Lithuania and bring the five children that they had at the time to join him in Dublin. George wrote to wish Meyer's family a safe journey, admonishing him, "Do not be sad at leaving Russia, for the leftover fruits of England, Ireland in other words, are better for us Jews than a full harvest of Russia. Be as strong as a lion to make a living, and as light as an eagle where you can earn even 1 penny." Even though Wigader was doing well enough by September 1891, he was not necessarily securely enough established to be bringing his family over to join him. His brother Bernard advised him to be slow and calm and not to rush his family over. However, one of the most valuable elements of the Chronicle is the insight we get into the emotional aspect of migration, the disruption, the trauma, the pain and guilt of separation, a matrix of emotions that the psychologist Sue Lieberman describes as an invisible baggage. Lieberman describes how migration is a potentially disruptive event in a person's life, an uprooting from everything that was familiar and a transplantation into an alien environment. It brought an emotional fallout of loss, sorrow, helplessness, and guilt that was associated with the close relatives, formative experiences, and mother tongue that migrants were forced to leave behind them. It's often borne in silence, the pain, and transmitted to later generations as an unspoken sense of loss, especially at this time where it really wasn't necessarily the norm to speak about past experience. So this loss is transmitted to later generations in a sense of the loss of one's roots and a not knowing anything about one's past. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why Jews are particularly fascinated with family history, maybe more so than other groups. And I think that this invisible baggage is very clear from the photo of Wigader, that the library has chosen to advertise this talk, which I've used as a backdrop for my presentation. I'm not sure how clearly it comes across in the slides, but as well as a certain otherworldliness, I see a lot of pain in his eyes. And even though his story was ostensibly a success story, after a relatively short time, he found a permanent home in Dublin and was able to send for his family, again, fairly quickly. And Dublin, in the long run, was kind to all of them. Meyer progressed to owning his own shop, and his eldest son, Harry, who was very resourceful and energetic, while he was still in his early 20s, opened up his own shop. And he founded a successful chain of businesses, which is still in operation and still known as Wigader's. However, in resolving one source of pain, the separation from his wife and family, Wigader was left with another irresolvable dilemma, which was the suffering of his mother Tzvia, who was devastated when his family relocated to Ireland. And I feel that this was a guilt that Wigader carried for the rest of his life. Even though he had other siblings who remained close to his mother, and she was pleased to see her son and his family do well in Ireland, she still suffered a terrible, inconsolable grief at being parted from Meyer and his family. And this, for me, is one of the most poignant aspects of the Chronicle, and one that really helps me to appreciate the personal costs of mass emigration. Within a few days, in July 1889, Wigader had had a bitter parting from his mother and a tearful parting from his family. All the time that he was in transit, struggling to survive and persevere in Amsterdam and Antwerp and wherever else he stopped on the way to Dublin, there was a flow of correspondence back and forth with his wife and his mother. And he describes the exchange of letters that he had with his wife while he was in Amsterdam as very upsetting. She told him how she cried constantly and was unable to eat, and how the children were inconsolable. Meanwhile, his mother wrote about how she felt brokenhearted and cried day and night. When Wigader was in Antwerp, his wife wrote about her anxiety for him and her constant tears of worry. Wigader's mother sent him money that George had sent her, as she felt that Wigader needed it more than she did, or Meyer needed it more than she did. Soon after his arrival in Dublin, he received a letter from his mother that he remembered contained no news, but she complains bitterly about her harsh fate, that her children left her and she remains as an oak tree which has shed its leaves. And his wife wrote that she was torn in two by their separation. Wigader vividly described his own suffering to Israel through being parted from his family, saying, "One day in the land of my wandering is reckoned by me as 1,000 years." And I think that's a sentiment that we can probably all relate to, thinking back to difficult times in our own lives. This is exactly why, when Bernard encouraged Meyer to hold off on bringing his family to Dublin, George disagreed, saying, "It makes no difference to you if your wife spends your earnings in Leijeve or Dublin." George understood that the moral support that was to be gained by being reunited with his family was as or more important than money. He also pointed out that even though things would be difficult financially, the children would be able to learn skills and trades, and everyone would be so much happier just to be together again. And he was spot on with this advice. Although supporting his family created a huge burden of work and financial worry for Wigader, because he was forced to work day and night and no longer had any time for leisure or the reading and studying that had previously been so important to him in his life. In his memoir, he recalls that he had to fight to save myself from being completely submerged by economic facts. But he expresses no regrets at his decision. He is clearly happy to be able to support his family, however trying this was. So this was obviously the right decision for him. His mother, Sophia, was devastated to part from Wigader's family. And her subsequent letter is one of the most resonant and moving parts for me of the entire chronicle. She states, "Woe is me, I never believed that you would no longer come here. How can I live on earth without seeing you again? My world has turned dark and my soul weeps in secret, for you are my spirit and soul, and your children are dearer to me than precious gold." Sadly, though George considered at different times bringing their mother to live in either Palestine or in Dublin, his ideas never came to fruition. Meyer never met with his mother again, and she died in Leijeve in August 1897. Meyer and his brothers were devastated by her death. Even after his year of mourning, Meyer remained depressed and was still not sleeping well. But he had no choice other than to keep working and carry on. In his published memoir, he pays tribute to his mother's generation for having sacrificed everything to give their children opportunity. However, because of migration, they were never able to see the fruits of their sacrifice. And in he draws a parallel with Moses, which is perhaps the greatest tribute that anyone could possibly get. Wigader states, "They led their children to the promised land, but they themselves had not been permitted to enter." The disruptive effects of migration are also visible in Wigader's description of the community in Dublin that he found. In a passage from his published memoir that has often been quoted out of context, he describes how money, as opposed to character and learning, had come to determine who was able to access the local synagogues and lead the Dublin community. Various commentators have equated this with an increase in materialism or a growing laxity in Jewish observance among immigrants. However, if we look at the comments before and after, we can see that Wigader, in fact, recognises that what he was observing were the consequences of a disruptive event in Jewish society. He states, the flow of immigration into Ireland has been heavy and unsystematic. In general, the changing from one land to another has played havoc with the social values as we formerly appreciated them. The process of developing a balanced community will take 2 or 3 generations. The community is virtually in a state of flux. And how Wigader understood what he was observing is even clearer from a letter that he wrote to Israel in 1897. He wrote, "Here in Dublin are found various people who arrived from the ends of the earth, from Poland, Galicia, and Austria, divided by their quality into classes, and it is sometimes hard to tell, even when checking carefully, between a wealthy man and one who walks all over town, selling his pictures to make a good profit. Therefore it happens that some people who are leaders in their homeland live here in lowly circumstances, and nobody takes it upon himself to honour them greatly, and to give preference to those who are worthy, more than the lowly people and refugees from Russia. Those who are lowly in their homeland, when they accrue wealth, they make the greatest efforts to grasp the golden sceptre and to wear an honourable crown which does not suit them at all. Therefore, it bothers me greatly when I see sometimes people who act badly and blatantly desecrate all that is sacred, yet are esteemed in all gatherings as long as they are reckoned to be wealthy. They give them a seat at the head of the table and they are appointed leaders." These comments are particularly enlightening in considering the issues of class within Irish Jewish society, because anyone who is interested in investigating how this worked would be quite hard put to find any significant information on class distinctions within the immigrant community. In particular, there's very little evidence of trade unionism and other forms of socialist activism. Wigader's reflections show that this was not necessarily because everyone in the immigrant community was in the same boat and there were no major class distinctions, but the class was a complex matter that operated on 2 levels within a relatively traditional Jewish society, a moral level and an economic level. And this is perhaps why historians have found it so difficult to decode in retrospect in the Irish context, though it still doesn't explain an apparent lack of socialist activity in the major Irish communities. It seems to me that this is something that must have existed, but perhaps being concealed as or considered irrelevant as the community developed an official shared memory of this time. A final aspect of Wigader's memoir that I wanted to consider was what was different or distinctive about Dublin that enabled Meyer to settle here, establish himself, make a living, and ultimately succeed where he failed elsewhere. And I believe that the answer is the personal touch or human networks, as Yonai Spitzer has suggested. That this is the factor that made the difference between the success and the failure of migration. The crucial difference with Dublin for Wigader was the support networks that were available to him here. This persuaded George to settle in Ireland as well, when he had only intended to stop off briefly in order to learn some English before travelling onwards to South Africa. Wigader's arrival in Dublin is presented in the Chronicle and in his memoir as in a quite serendipitous manner. But it's clear that he already knew that various friends and relatives had moved to Dublin and were doing well here, and that there was nothing accidental about it. And we can see that he found and renewed contact with a number of friends, acquaintances, and relatives after arriving here. To wrap up, it's worth recapping what there is that we can learn by focusing in such close detail on the experience of one individual. The critics of autobiographical memory consider it to be overly focused on seemingly insignificant minutiae of a person's personal and home life, as opposed to the bigger, more general picture of events that have wide-reaching consequences. On the other hand, those who champion oral history and memoir as important historical sources point out that these can give us an important supplement to the bigger picture by filling in details and allowing us to understand how individuals experienced events of world importance, how they reacted to them and how they reflected on them, and how these events impacted on local communities. Wigader's Chronicle ticks all of these boxes, corroborating contemporary scholarly findings and supplementing them with individual personal detail and reflection. The Chronicle allows us to move beyond popular stereotypes of mass migration, whether specifically Irish, Jewish stereotypes or more general stereotypes, to allow us to understand this process better and to relate it more specifically with greater confidence to the Irish setting. The Chronicles provide specific information on the community that Wigader found in Dublin, which is sufficient or substantial enough to alter the way in which we understand the community itself, how immigrants arrived here, and the type of community that they constructed on their arrival. Wigader allows us to get beneath the impersonal process, to drill down into the personal quandaries and emotions that formed an integral part of the experience of mass migration, that are completely inaccessible if we consider it only in very general ways. He shows that there were different degrees of separation, temporary and permanent, and all of these came with the possibility of a continual flow of correspondence backwards and forwards between Eastern Europe and the West, and even that occasional visits and reunions between families and friends could take place, that it wasn't, once somebody left Eastern Europe, it wasn't complete radio silence, and that people never had contact again, or people never returned even for a visit. In sum, the Chronicle demonstrates how the personal feeds back into the general, and how in turn the general feeds back into the personal, to enlighten academic historians, family historians, and anyone who has an interest in or a family background of mass migration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wynn. There are a few questions. Brian asked, in which language did Wigader write?
He wrote in Hebrew and Yiddish, both as far as I remember.
Thank you very much. Tim asked, what age was he when he arrived in Ireland?
Okay, now let me go back. He was born in 1855 and he arrived here in 1890, so that made him 45, if my maths are correct.
Thank you. How would the experience have differed for someone of lesser or less deep faith? Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't catch the rest of it.
How would the experience have been different for someone with lesser or less deep faith?
Well, I suppose everyone's individual experience varied. For a lot of people in leaving Eastern Europe wanted to get away from religion altogether and wanted to get away from the constraints of traditional Jewish observance. And a lot of people would have gravitated towards big centres with a varied Jewish life, like London or New York. And one scholar, Nancy Green, argues that people specifically chose different destinations because of what they had to offer. So they went to a particular place, like I think it was Paris, if they were of socialist leanings, because Paris had a great socialist scene. They went to New York if they wanted to abandon religion. So I suppose it's hard to generalize, because everyone's experience was very different, because we don't have, I suppose, an awful lot of personal testimony as well. And I think, there were many, many different options for people once they migrated. they had the choice then whether they would stay in the community and avail of its supports. And I suppose in a small community like Dublin, if people didn't really conform to what was expected of them, it would have been very easy to alienate themselves from the community. So there are a lot of things we would have to take into consideration when thinking about it. I hope that answers it.
Thank you very much. Iris asks if this has been translated into English.
Yes. The National Library of Israel have an English translation, which is great for me because my Hebrew and Yiddish wouldn't have been up to dealing with the original source. So, yes.
Thank you very much. There are many compliments in the chat. I will send you the transcript later. Many people thanking you for a wonderful presentation. Another question is, how would you read this differently if so much of it had not been reconstructed retrospectively?
Well, I think a lot of the diary, I think as opposed to the memoir, is reasonably contemporary, although there are gaps in it when Wigader was too busy to keep his journal. But I think that is a contrast between the Chronicle and the published memoir, because there is a lot more personal detail available to us from the Chronicle. Details that are edited out of the published memoir for whatever reason. And also, because the Chronicle is a private document that seems to have been intended just for immediate family, that also changes the way that Wigader would have expressed himself. Because when somebody, especially when they're gathering their own personal thoughts, for a public memoir, people are unconsciously wishing to present themselves in a particular way, whereas the Chronicle, I would hope, would be a more honest type of a document, that would give us more access to personal thoughts and feelings than a published memoir. And I think that this is why it's so very important, because we do have a number of, some very famous memoirs of mass migration, like Mary Anton's Promised Land. But, it's the personal element that's in the Chronicle that to me makes it so fascinating and such an important source.
Thank you very much. Was there anything in the Chronicle that surprised you?
To think back, well, I think there was a lot of it that I found really fascinating, and I think just the fact, the way that it corroborates more recent thinking on Jewish mass migration. I suppose what you could consider surprising would be, the flow of correspondence, actually, the degree to which the family was able to stay in touch, which of course they were an educated family, and if somebody was less educated, perhaps the possibility wasn't there so much to keep in touch. But I think it's the flow of letters that followed Wigader in his travels around Europe, and how this gave such an amazing insight into his experiences.
Thank you very, very much. I would like to invite Thelma Fry to speak. Okay, I just made her a co-host, so she'll be able to open her microphone. Thelma Fry is Mayor Yoel Wigader's granddaughter. She's an actress.
Can you hear me?
Yes, but I'm introducing you. Thelma Fry is Mayor Yoel Wigader's granddaughter. She's an actress and teacher of English to a generation of Israelis who watched educational television. She is a dear friend to the National Library of Israel and was instrumental in obtaining the diary for the NLI collections. Thank you, Thelma. Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, I'm so glad. That was really so interesting and so wonderful for us to hear all about my grandfather. I was only 8 when he died in 1933, so my memories of him are rather fuzzy. I just remember a big beard and a lot of love, but some things about him I'd like to share with you. it amused me when I read the diary that he was such a monarchist. He was mad about the English royal family. He even writes in detail one of the coronation, every detail of the coronation. And in 1917, when there was an uprising in Dublin, the famous uprising, he writes, "There's some trouble today, and I'm very worried whether Harry's going to be able to get across the town to the kosher butcher to bring back the meat for Shabbos." That's all he wrote about the uprising. And one of my favorite stories was told by my mother. My dad, when he qualified as a dentist, went to live in Leeds. My mother was born and brought up in Leeds. And Daddy took her to Dublin to meet her future father-in-law. Now, Grandpa had a paint and wallpaper shop. So when Mummy walked into the shop, there was this sage, this beautiful man with a yarmulke and a beard, didn't even look up. He was busy writing his famous books. And because it was a wallpaper shop, they sold pictures. So round this famous old Jewish figure were all pictures of the baby Jesus and Mother Mary and Jesus on the cross. But I want to say a thank you, a big thank you to Charles Wiggader and to everyone at the library who made it possible to translate and publish this diary, which means a great deal to me and my family. And I'm very proud that I am the one who discovered and managed to purchase this document, which I think is very important. And I'm very glad tonight that it's been shared with so many people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thelma. Thank you so much, Dr. Natalie Wynn. Thank you all from all over the world for being here. I'm going to open the microphones for all to say thank you. And if anyone has any further questions, again, thank you very much. And Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Wynn. Thanks, everyone.
I'll second you, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's been very fascinating.
Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. The whole, everything was so interesting. And I think the important thing, it does apply to present day Jewish migration, which, you know, I'm originally from South America, and now I live in Spain, and many of the things that you talk about in this diary, you know, I think I had lived through that also.
Thank you.
Dr. Wynn, could you possibly give us your email address again? I saw it on the first slide, but I couldn't see it very well. It was so small, and these glasses are not very good.
I can put it into the chat.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting. Just a personal note to Thelma. Thelma, I'm a descendant of Bernard Wiggader, who was Mayor Joel's brother. And our side of the family went to South Africa and not to Ireland or to America. And as a youngster in particular, my mother Pearl used to always talk about you, Thelma, and she mentioned your name many times over. And it's just wonderful to see you and to make your acquaintance, even if it's via the Zoom.
Oh, how lovely, cousin, to meet you.
Great to meet you as well. Where do you live, Thelma?
I live in London. I'm 96 now, but I'm still very happy and very well and enjoying every day of my life. I'm very proud to be a Wiggader.
God bless you. Thank you very much.
Still wearing the makeup?
Don't say.
No, closely related to me.
What?
Thelma, I was saying, Quentin Creevon, we met in the Bernsteins many, many, many years ago when you were in Dublin.
Oh, yes.
And you probably may remember my mother, Sylvia Creevon.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
And very lovely to see you. Lovely to see you looking so well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lovely to see you too. I think this is wonderful that there are people here from all over the world. I see even from India, somebody's with us.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
My grandma.
Actually, my wife's grandmother,
The Wigger.
she was a Wigger. She lived in Belfast.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
So,
Her brother Louis Wigger as well used to live in Belfast.
Yeah, there were 3 Louis Wiggers. One was my father. I've got a photo of the 3 Louis Wiggers somewhere.
Oh,
Yes. There's
there's Lynn.
Lynn. Hello, Lynn.
Yeah, can I just say that I'm the granddaughter of Jacob Mayer Wigger, the same as Louise here, Louise Crevon, who lived in Belfast. In fact, my Hebrew name is Meira, so I'm actually called after him. What relation is he to Mayor Joe? Is he a cousin or a brother?
I'm not sure there is a relationship. Are you? Because he's certainly not a cousin or a brother.
Ooh.
And I don't know how they got to the Wiggers of Belfast. Anyhow, you're very welcome. I'm glad to claim you as a cousin.
Good, me too. It's a deal.
It's a deal.
I think that Mayor Wigger in his book referred to his cousin who lived in Belfast and went to Belfast. And that would be my maternal grandmother.
Oh, I see.
Hi, I'm Stuart Kay. I'm also from Belfast. The reference. Hello. Hi, Louise. The reference in the book is to his uncle, who died in Belfast in 1930, who was my great-grandfather. I don't know, is there any other references in the new document to relatives in Belfast, as far as you're aware?
And it's so sad that I heard tonight that my great-grandmother only died in 1898, whereas my grandmother, Mayor's wife, Tamara, died in 1906. She was only in her early 40s. She'd had 9 children. I think she was just exhausted with the life that she'd led. And I'm called after her. 3 of us were called Tamara, is our Hebrew name. And Thelma is the nearest that they could get in English. One cousin was called Pamela because Tamar in Hebrew is a palm tree. And the other one actually kept the name Tamar in English.
Thank you all once more for being here. Thanks everyone from all over the world. It's wonderful to see such a wide variety of countries in one place at one time. Thank you all for being here. We'll see you in our next event. Once more, Laila Tov from Jerusalem.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Laila Tov.
Thank you for arranging this. Thank you very, very much. Really, from
Very
all
much,
sides.
Natalie, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Dr. Wynn. Bye.
Very interesting.
Bye.